Good morning, Anne Marie. Long time no see.
Good morning. It's been like 12 seconds.
In 12 seconds. Here we are just shooting in our fancy home studio.
So fancy, so fancy. You're welcome.
I want to talk today about imposter syndrome, which it's funny, right before we got on to do this recording, I was talking to a friend who I haven't spoken to in quite a long time. She's a lawyer, and she goes, "Oh, we were talking about something totally unrelated to anything professional." And she goes, "Oh my God, I saw your chat on imposter syndrome, and I was listening to it, and because I suffer from that." And I was like, "You do?" I mean, this is a woman who is incredibly shiny, top of her game. To the outside, viewer is like killing it, slaying it. And this topic resonated with her, which I found to be really interesting. And last week, as you know, I did a little Friday panel chat with two women about this very topic, about imposter syndrome. And the response that I have gotten and that you have gotten and that our company has gotten to that has frankly, been really surprising to me. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about imposter syndrome and kind of the stories that we tell ourselves. What has been your experience, as a coach and as a trainer and as a speaker over the last 10 plus years? How often is this coming up? Is it coming up more now than ever before? What's behind all that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's way more common than people think, and accomplished people have as much imposter syndrome as anybody else. Your level of accomplishment in no way is relational to your imposter syndrome.
That's a really good point. Yes.
That's the big myth, that if you're really accomplished, that somehow that's the antidote to imposter syndrome. And it actually isn't. I'll just very briefly share my own story about this. In graduate school, you had to take a course outside of your area of study. I got a master's degree in American literature. I did this social science thing. You had to do this pilot study. I knew nothing about how to do this. They're like, it's not that bad. And then Harvard gives you this, like, it's this thick on like all of the rules of doing this study. And I was like, oh my God.
And it's Harvard, right?
Yeah. And I was like, I can't do this. And my highest goal, if I'm being honest, was just to like get through it. And I was like, I just have to do this. I was having my first child. I was pregnant in that class, having my first child. I missed exactly one day of class giving birth to him. And basically what happened is you turned in your study, it was graded, you presented, and when you came, and then the professor also graded your presentation and handed it back to you. And she handed it to me and said, please speak with me after class. And my heart immediately dropped to my stomach and I said, okay. And as I went and sat down, I lifted it up and it was an A. And then I went and talked to her and she said, this is a really great study. It's got this really elegant simplicity about it. Simple, let's just be honest. And she said, I'd love to publish it with you and consort with you. And I think this is a great pilot and we could absolutely do this. It was on gender. And I said, yes, that sounds fantastic. And then I never answered a single one of her emails or calls. And it would have literally changed the course of my academic life. She was a professor at the medical school. This would have changed the course of my academic life and opportunity. But I was absolutely certain she was going to figure out that I wasn't that smart, that I had charmed my way to her somehow in writing this.
Or this was like a fluke.
It was a fluke.
Right.
And so I think that it rises up to people because we culturally get a lot of messaging constantly, and we talk about this in executive presence, a lot of biased feedback. We just had a client talking about, she was told not to laugh too loud. Right. I've had clients told that nobody can take them seriously wearing such bright colors. I've had people.
What is that?
A myriad of things.
Right.
We've heard of gay men being told they need to drop their voice, like a myriad of biased feedback. So what happens is, I always say, I liken it to the fact of eating a little bit of poison every day won't necessarily kill you, but it'll make you really, really sick. And so consuming all of that messaging in one place or another makes you sick. And you don't see yourself as you are. You see yourself as this sort of compromised version that somebody's going to somehow out you at any moment and say, hey, you don't belong. Holly and I bonded, and our own origin story comes from when I very first had a real sit down with her. I said, did you grow up in a culture of poverty, like within the first 5 minutes? And to which you cried, of course, because I'm like,
that's what people do when they
people are always crying.
Cry.
And she's like, yes, how did you know? And part of that is it's the language, it's the framing, it's the posturing, because that was my experience too. And I have no shame about that.
Right.
And it has informed what I think I'm entitled to, where I think I belong, how people perceive me. And so I think there are all kinds of reasons for it, but I think it's incredibly real, and it impacts people in that they don't reach for things that they could easily get because they don't think they're entitled to them.
Oh, I've told the story before about how I threw, my interview for the Rhodes Fellowship in college, and I'll be brief, but because I want to get to some strategies that folks can, implement to kind of combat this. But in my experience, I was, first generation college student and went to Indiana State University, and on a full ride scholarship. And I felt the entire 4 years that I was in this small program that people were going to realize that I didn't belong there for all of the reasons. I didn't fit like what an academic student really looked like and all of that stuff. And, my background really didn't conform with anybody else that was part of this very small, very elite program. And I was asked to interview for the Rhodes, and I completely blew it because I didn't really understand what I was going to go do in that interview. And I thought I could kind of, it's that mix of like youthful overconfidence, but also feeling like a complete imposter, which I think sometimes go together,
Yeah, I call that fat and starving.
Yeah, totally.
I call it fat and starving. And I encounter this with clients all the time. They have this like hubris, like this puffery,
right?
But they have no self-worth.
It was masking, yes.
And what it's really masking is like you're fat, you have this fat, to the outside world sees this like, sort of emboldened ego, but you're starving inside.
Yeah, and I remember talking to the then dean of the journalism school, who was in that panel afterward, and he was like, "What happened?" And I was like, "I had no business being in there." I mean, I cut myself off at the knees before I even started, and I think so. This gets into what I think is really powerful for what we do. People will say, "Well, like, how do I get over this?" And I think, you're never probably going to get over it, but a huge first step is giving voice to it and telling your story, right? We say all the time, story is an invitation to come closer, right? It creates vulnerability, and authenticity is the shortest way to if you want to shorten that gap between people, this is how you do it. And I think, what we've seen just with these very informal chats we've done on imposter syndrome, and then, the ones we're preparing for in executive presence, is that people are surprised to hear that other people are having this experience.
Totally.
Right? And to give a voice to it and to call it out, I think is incredibly powerful. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think absolutely talking about it. And I think it's also this sort of, from a cognitive behavioral perspective, it's the story you tell yourself and trying to come up with a counter narrative to that story.
Yes.
And I'll give like a tiny example. I had a client who was constantly saying, I'm a procrastinator, I'm a procrastinator, I'm a procrastinator. This is somebody who went to Stanford, who went to, a very fancy law firm, who did all this. And I said, have you ever missed a deadline in your entire life? And she's like, no, never. And I said, then stop telling yourself you're a procrastinator. Tell yourself, I'm somebody who has never missed a deadline in my entire life.
Right.
Because when you tell yourself that, you're beating yourself up for the ways in which you were inferior. Right. And I think that there are all kinds of ways we do this. That was just a really, really tiny example. But I think, when I'm saying things like, oh, I'm not somebody who can do this or X, Y, or Z, what I ask myself is that true? Is that really true? Can I find a position to the contrary to prove that statement wrong? Right. And frequently you can. I mean, my running joke, as Holly knows, when we do executive groups is, somebody will be extremely overqualified and go, well, but I haven't done that work on a Tuesday with somebody with brown hair. Right. And to find one example in which they haven't done it. And it's like, oh my God. And I always say, the world will erect plenty of barriers for you and obstacles for you. That's the nature of life. you don't need to do that for yourself as well. You need to figure out how to be kinder and gentler towards yourself so that you can be braver and stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I actually think that's a great way to close this out. We are doing a training on executive presence, on July 22nd. And so if any of this speaks to you, if you're watching this and you want to go deeper, you can find all the information about that on our website, which is storyimprinting.com. And thank you, Anne-Marie, as always, for your expertise.
Thank you, friend. I'll see you soon.
See you next time.